The airport was alive with noise and movement. Travelers rushed past one another, dragging suitcases and carrying coffee cups, voices blending into an endless hum of excitement and stress. Among the sea of people walked a man who immediately stood out. He wore a crisp suit, his shoes shining as though polished just that morning. By his side was his wife, elegant and graceful, holding the hand of their young son. This family was wealthy. Everyone could see that from the way they carried themselves and from the luxury brand tags hanging on their luggage. They were used to comfort, to being treated with respect, and to having everything under control. The boy, however, was different from his parents in more ways than one. He was only 8 years old, with bright eyes that darted around the airport. Every sound, every announcement over the loudspeaker, every beep from the scanners seemed louder to him than to anyone else. He pressed his hands over his ears sometimes, shifting uncomfortably as his parents guided him through the busy terminal. He was autistic, and while his parents loved him deeply, they knew traveling could be difficult. Crowds, strange noises, and unfamiliar environments often overwhelmed him. As they reached the boarding gate, the father handed over their tickets. Passengers around them glanced at the family with a mix of curiosity and recognition. Some even whispered, noticing the millionaire who had been featured in business magazines before. People admired his success, his wealth, and the way he seemed to have everything in life. But no one could see the challenges behind the polished image, especially the challenge of raising a child who needed special care. When the boarding announcement was made, the family walked toward the plane. The boy gripped his mother's hand tightly, his small fingers trembling slightly. The hum of engines outside and the sight of the massive aircraft waiting for them filled him with both fascination and fear. His father carried himself confidently, smiling politely at the flight attendants as they stepped into the cabin. The family was shown to their first-class seats, wide and comfortable, with sparkling glasses of water already placed on the trays. To most people, it looked like the perfect start to a long journey. The father placed his laptop bag carefully under the seat, preparing to relax, while his wife helped their son settle into his seat. She adjusted his seatbelt gently, whispering soft reassurances in his ear. The boy looked around the cabin, his wide eyes scanning the faces of strangers. The air smelled of perfume, coffee, and the faint trace of jet fuel drifting in from outside. Flight attendants moved gracefully up and down the aisles, welcoming passengers and stowing luggage. Other travelers in first class stole glances at the boy. Some smiled kindly, others looked away, but most expected a peaceful flight in the quiet comfort of the front cabin. They didn't know how unpredictable the journey ahead would become. As the plane filled, the boy began to shift in his seat, fidgeting with the seatbelt and tugging at the fabric of his shirt. The tight space, the murmur of voices around him, and the clinking of glasses from nearby passengers seemed to grow louder in his head. His parents exchanged worried glances. They had seen this before. They whispered soothing words, offering him his favorite toy, trying to distract him. For a moment, he calmed, resting his head against the window as he watched the ground crew outside prepare the plane. The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing the flight details. The engines rumbled to life, and the plane slowly backed away from the gate. For most passengers, it was routine. For the boy, it was overwhelming. He pressed his hands against his ears again, rocking slightly in his seat. His mother rubbed his back gently, while his father squeezed his hand, silently praying that their son would manage the takeoff without too much stress. The plane rolled down the runway, the engines roaring louder and louder. Passengers leaned back as the aircraft lifted into the air, climbing steadily into the sky. The boy gripped his mother's arm tightly, his eyes wide with fear. She whispered softly, trying to reassure him, while the father tried to distract him with a story about the clouds outside. For a few minutes, things seemed manageable. The boy stayed quiet, though restless, as the plane leveled out above the clouds. His parents sighed in relief, believing they might get through the flight peacefully. Passengers around them returned to their books, headphones, and conversations, unaware of what was to come. But the calm wouldn't last. The new environment, the sounds, the pressure in his ears, all of it began to overwhelm the boy again. His parents saw the signs. The rapid breathing, the shaking hands, the restless movements. They braced themselves, knowing a meltdown was coming. The flight attendants continued serving drinks with warm smiles, unaware of the storm about to break in first class. Passengers reclined their seats, ready for hours of quiet relaxation. To them, this was just another flight. But for one family, it was already turning into a struggle. And somewhere in the back of the plane, in the crowded economy section, a poor black boy leaned against his seat, unaware that he would soon play a role in a story that none of the passengers, or the wealthy family themselves, would ever forget. The plane had reached its cruising altitude. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, painted in shades of blue and white, with soft clouds floating like cotton below. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere seemed calm. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some flipping through magazines, others closing their eyes for a nap. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, pouring drinks and offering snacks with polite smiles. In first class, however, things were not calm. The young boy, the millionaire's autistic son, sat stiff in his seat, his little body tense as though he was holding back a storm. His eyes darted around nervously, unable to focus on one thing. The sound of the engines, steady and loud, pulsed in his ears like thunder. Every click of a seatbelt, every cough from another passenger, seemed to echo 10 times louder to him. He tugged at his seatbelt, twisting in his chair, his breathing growing quicker. His mother leaned toward him, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. We're safe. Just relax." She stroked his hair gently, but her touch didn't soothe him this time. The father placed a hand on his son's knee, trying to anchor him. "Look outside, son," he said calmly, pointing to the window. "See the clouds? They look like pillows. Aren't they beautiful?" For a brief moment, the boy glanced outside, but the brightness of the sun reflecting off the clouds made him squint and turn away quickly. His hands clutched at his shirt, pulling at the fabric, his chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. Then it began. At first, it was a whimper, a low sound that drew curious glances from the nearby passengers. The whimper grew into a cry, high-pitched and trembling. Within seconds, the cry became a scream. The boy screamed with all the force of his lungs, his face red, tears streaming down his cheeks. His body thrashed against the seatbelt, kicking at the seat in front of him. The cabin that had been calm moments ago was now filled with the sharp, piercing sound of a child in distress. Passengers stiffened in their seats, turning to look. Some frowned, others sighed, already irritated. A few shook their heads, muttering under their breath. The mother tried to hold her son close, wrapping her arms around him. "Shoo, baby, it's okay. Mommy's here. You're safe." But the boy pushed against her, arching his back, screaming louder. He was not angry, he was overwhelmed. His senses were flooded, and his mind was struggling to find balance. The father reached into the bag by his feet, pulling out his son's favorite toy, a small airplane figurine. He handed it to him with trembling hands. "Here, son. Look, your plane. Remember? You love this." For a moment, the boy clutched the toy, staring at it through his tears. Hope flickered in his parents' eyes. But then, just as quickly, he hurled the toy to the ground and screamed even louder. The father bent down to pick it up, his hands shaking with helplessness. Passengers exchanged annoyed glances. One woman covered her ears with her hands. A man in the row across leaned over to his neighbor and whispered harshly, "Why can't they control him? Some people shouldn't even travel with kids like that." The words stung, even though the parents pretended not to hear. The mother's face flushed with embarrassment, tears welling in her own eyes. She kept rocking her son, whispering soothing words that went unheard. The father sat frozen for a moment, staring at his boy, his chest tight with a helpless ache. He was a man who had solved problems worth millions, made decisions that shaped companies. But here, at 30,000 feet in the air, he couldn't ease his own child's pain. The boy's screams grew louder, filling every corner of the cabin. Flight attendants hurried over, kneeling beside the family with concerned expressions. "Can we help? Do you need anything?" one asked gently. The mother shook her head quickly, her voice trembling. He's autistic. He just needs time. Please. Some passengers softened at her words, realizing this wasn't simply a tantrum, but others only grew more irritated, muttering louder. Autistic or not, this is ridiculous. I paid for first class to relax, not this. The boy's cries didn't stop. He kicked against the tray table, pulled at his mother's hair, and buried his face into her shoulder, screaming as though the entire world was closing in on him. His body shook with the intensity of his meltdown. The father tried again, his voice breaking. Please, son, please breathe. Just breathe with me. In, out, in. He demonstrated, inhaling and exhaling deeply. But his son didn't respond. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The family was drowning in stares, whispers, and judgment, surrounded by people but utterly alone. The parents' wealth, their status, their first-class seats. None of it mattered now. They were just two parents, helpless against the storm inside their child. The mother held him tighter, rocking him back and forth, whispering through her own tears. Please calm down, baby. Please. The boy only screamed louder. And yet, as hopeless as it seemed, somewhere in the back of the plane, far from the soft seats and polished glasses of first class, a pair of eyes was watching. A poor black boy, seated in economy with nothing but a small bag of belongings, had been listening. He didn't hear just the screams. He heard the pain inside them. While others saw annoyance, he saw suffering. While others turned away, he leaned forward. And in that moment, though he didn't yet know how, he felt deep inside that he had to do something. The storm in first class was far from over. But soon, something unexpected would change the entire flight, and no one on board would ever forget it. The boy's cries filled the cabin like thunder in a storm. There was no escape from the sound. It pressed against the walls, rang in every ear, and settled heavily in the hearts of everyone on board. What had begun as a few whimpers had now turned into full screams, sharp and desperate, echoing through the rows of seats. At first, passengers tried to ignore it. Some shifted in their seats, adjusting their headphones. Others turned pages of their magazines more quickly, forcing themselves to focus. But as the minutes passed and the screams grew louder, patience began to wear thin. In first class, a woman in pearls covered her ears with both hands, her face twisted in irritation. She leaned toward her husband and hissed, "This is unacceptable. We paid for peace, not this chaos." Her husband, a man with a stiff suit and a frown, nodded in agreement. He pressed the call button for a flight attendant, whispering complaints that weren't as quiet as he thought. A few rows back, a younger man in a hoodie shook his head. "Man, this is why I hate flying," he muttered, pulling his hood tighter over his head. His earbuds blasted music, but even that couldn't drown out the child's piercing voice. In economy, the reactions were mixed. Some passengers stared toward the front of the plane, their expressions a blend of curiosity and annoyance. "What's going on up there?" a teenage girl whispered to her friend, holding her phone ready as if even this moment could become something worth posting. Her friend rolled her eyes. "Just some spoiled kid, probably. Parents don't know how to control him." Not everyone was unkind. An older woman sitting near the aisle pressed her palms together, shaking her head softly. "Poor child," she whispered. "He must be in pain." She looked toward the parents, her eyes full of sympathy, though she could do nothing from where she sat. Back in first class, the parents felt the stares like daggers. The mother's face flushed red as she held her son tighter, rocking him in her arms. She could hear the whispers, the sighs, the groans of passengers covering their ears. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She just kept whispering to her son, hoping something, anything, would help. The father sat stiffly beside them, his jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him. For a man who commanded boardrooms, who signed contracts worth millions, the humiliation was unbearable. He looked around at the faces of the passengers, saw the irritation, the disdain. In their eyes, his son was not a child in pain. He was a disturbance. and that broke the father's heart more than the screams themselves. Flight attendants hurried back and forth, their professional smiles faltering. They whispered to each other in the galley, unsure of what more they could do. One approached the family, kneeling beside the mother. "Can we get him anything?" she asked gently. "Maybe a different seat? Something to calm him?" The mother shook her head quickly, tears spilling now. "He's autistic," she explained softly. He doesn't understand. He's overwhelmed. We're trying." Her voice cracked with exhaustion. The attendant nodded sympathetically, but the noise in the cabin made her job harder. Passengers had started pressing their call buttons, waving her over with complaints. "Do something about that child. I can't sit through 10 hours of this. This is ruining the flight." The pressure grew heavier with every minute. The boy screamed louder, kicking his legs, his small fists beating against the seat. His toy airplane, now back in his lap, was hurled to the floor again, rolling beneath the seats. His face was red, tears streaming endlessly as his voice grew hoarse from crying. The mother's arms shook from holding him. The father leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, trying to block out the noise, the stares, the shame. In the rows around them, frustration grew. A businessman sighed loudly, slamming his laptop shut. A woman shoved earplugs into her ears, muttering curses under her breath. Another man flagged down a flight attendant, demanding, "Can you move me somewhere else? I didn't pay for this nonsense." But not every face carried anger. In the corner of the economy cabin, the poor black boy sat quietly, his chin resting on his hand as he watched. His seat was cramped, the armrest loose, the food tray wobbly. He didn't have the luxuries of first class, no soft pillows, no sparkling water. Yet his eyes weren't filled with irritation like the others. He saw something different. He watched the boy's small hands shaking, his feet kicking not out of anger but out of desperation. He watched the parents' faces, the exhaustion, the silent plea for understanding. Where others saw disturbance, he saw struggle. Where others saw annoyance, he saw pain. The poor boy's heart tightened. He remembered moments from his own life, times when people had judged him unfairly, had looked at him with the same irritation, the same whispers behind their hands. He knew what it felt like to be misunderstood. As the screams continued, the poor boy leaned back in his seat, deep in thought. He didn't know how yet, but he felt an urge building inside him, an urge to help, to reach across the invisible wall that separated first class from economy, to do what no one else on that plane seemed willing to do. For now, though, the cabin remained heavy with tension. Some passengers glared, others muttered, and still others buried their heads in pillows, wishing the noise would stop. But none of them realized that the true turning point of the flight was coming. Not from wealth, not from authority, but from the kindness of someone they had barely noticed at all. The passengers thought they had seen the worst. They had no idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. The millionaire sat frozen in his wide leather seat, but inside he was collapsing. His son's screams tore through him like knives. Every cry felt heavier than the last, every kick like a reminder of his own helplessness. He had faced boardrooms of powerful men. He had signed deals worth millions. He had been praised in magazines for his brilliance and leadership. Yet here, at 30,000 feet above the clouds, he could not calm the one person who mattered most. His little boy. His wife was already in tears. She held their son tightly, rocking him back and forth as best she could. Her voice was soft and trembling, whispering words of comfort again and again. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here. You're safe. It's okay, baby." But the boy could not hear her through the storm in his head. His fists pounded against her arms, his legs kicked against the seat, his body twisting like it wanted to escape everything at once. She looked around the cabin and immediately regretted it. Faces stared back at her, cold, annoyed, judgmental. Some rolled their eyes, others whispered, and a few glared openly as though she and her child had committed a crime by being there. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream at them that her son wasn't misbehaving, that he wasn't spoiled, that he wasn't trying to ruin their flight. He was autistic. He was overwhelmed. He was hurting in ways they could not see. but the words caught in her throat. No one wanted excuses. They only wanted silence. The father leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. He stared at the floor, his mind racing. There must be something I can do. He thought of every tool he had ever used in business: logic, persuasion, control. None of it mattered now. His son's world was crumbling in his arms, and his wealth, his power, his status. None of it could save him. He reached for his son again, trying to catch his little hands. Breathe, son. Just breathe with me. In and out like we practiced. Come on, champ. He inhaled deeply, exaggerated the movement, then exhaled slowly. But his son only screamed louder, thrashing harder. The toy airplane, the one he loved at home, lay forgotten on the floor. The mother bent to pick it up, her hands shaking, then held it in front of her son. Look, baby, your plane. Do you want it? For a second, his eyes flickered toward it. But then he slapped it out of her hands, his cries rising higher. The father's heart sank. His chest felt heavy, his throat tight. He wanted to hold his son, to protect him from everything, but in that moment he couldn't even protect him from himself. He could hear the muttering passengers, the sharp sighs, the shifting of bodies in their seats, as if everyone was impatient for him to fix it. But he couldn't. One man in a business suit leaned toward a flight attendant. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly, not caring if the family heard. "We can't sit through hours of this. Do something." The flight attendant, caught between sympathy and duty, approached the family again. She knelt beside the mother, her voice gentle. "Ma'am, sir, is there anything at all we can do for you? Perhaps a quieter place in the cabin? Headphones for him?" The mother shook her head helplessly, tears spilling freely now. "He doesn't understand. He just needs time." Her voice cracked, broken. The attendant nodded softly, but the pressure in the cabin was rising. Call buttons flashed. Hands waved impatiently. Passengers whispered louder, some covering their ears, others shaking their heads in frustration. The father sat back, his head resting against the seat, his eyes closed. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. He thought about all the times people had admired him, calling him a man who could solve anything. But here he was, with his crying son in his wife's arms, unable to solve the one problem that mattered most. He reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it tightly. Her eyes met his, red and wet, both of them silently asking the same question. What if this never stops? Time slowed. The boy's cries filled every corner of the plane, drowning out the hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers, even the calming announcements from the captain. The family was trapped, not just in the cabin, but in the judgment of everyone around them. The mother buried her face in her son's hair, her tears falling onto his shoulders. "Please, baby," she whispered desperately. "Please calm down. You're okay. Please." Her voice cracked into sobs, her heart breaking as she felt the judgmental eyes on her. She wished she could take her son away, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. But there was no escape. The father finally stood, pacing a step in the narrow aisle before sitting again, running his hands through his hair. He was a man used to control, but he was unraveling. His son's cries echoed not just in the cabin, but in his very soul. He wished he could trade places with him, carry the weight of his overwhelm, take away the pain. But he couldn't. He was powerless. And as the parents drowned in their desperation, most of the passengers only grew colder. To them, this was an inconvenience. To the parents, it was heartbreak. But not everyone on that plane saw it the same way. In the crowded economy section, the poor black boy still watched quietly. He saw the mother's tears, the father's helplessness, the boy's anguish. He didn't see a spoiled child. He didn't see bad parenting. He saw suffering, and something deep inside him stirred. The parents didn't know it yet, but help was coming. From the most unexpected place. Far back in economy class, where the seats were tighter, the food trays scratched, and the air smelled faintly of plastic and reheated meals, sat a boy most passengers didn't notice. He was dressed in simple clothes, nothing branded, his sneakers worn at the edges. His seatbelt was a little too loose, the fabric fraying, but he didn't complain. He sat quietly, gazing out the window at the endless sky, until the sound of crying drew his attention. At first, he thought it was just a restless child. Crying on planes wasn't unusual. Babies cried, toddlers fussed. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew sharper, louder, and filled with something different. It wasn't just whining. It was pain. It was fear. The boy shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his dark eyes narrowing with concern. He could see the commotion up ahead, even from the crowded rows of economy. Heads were turning, flight attendants moved quickly toward first class, and the noise of the autistic child's screams reached even the back of the plane. Passengers around him groaned, rolled their eyes, and shook their heads. "Here we go again," muttered a man 2 rows in front, stuffing earbuds into his ears. "That kid's out of control," whispered a woman, clutching her purse tighter. "Some people shouldn't even fly with children," said another under her breath. The boy listened to them all, but his face remained calm. Where they heard annoyance, he heard something else. He didn't hear misbehavior, he heard suffering. The pitch of the child's screams carried desperation, not defiance. The boy recognized that sound because he knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, to be looked at with irritation instead of compassion. Growing up, the boy had lived a life where patience and understanding weren't always given to him. He was used to being judged for his appearance, his clothes, his background. He knew what it was like to be dismissed without anyone bothering to ask why. And now, as he watched the scene unfold in first class, his heart ached for the crying child and the exhausted parents. He could see the mother holding her son tightly, her shoulders shaking as she whispered over and over into his ear. He could see the father leaning forward, his face pale with helplessness. The boy didn't know them, but he didn't need to. He understood what others didn't, that this wasn't about bad parenting or spoiled behavior. This was about a child overwhelmed by a world that felt too loud, too bright, too much. The voices of irritation around him grew louder. "Why don't they just give him medicine?" someone muttered. "I can't sit through hours of this," said another, pressing the call button for a flight attendant. People were quick to judge, quick to blame, but not one of them stepped forward to help. The poor boy's chest tightened. He couldn't explain why, but he felt a pull inside him, a voice telling him to do something. He didn't have money, he didn't have status, and he didn't sit in first class where his voice might carry weight. But what he had was empathy, and sometimes empathy was worth more than all the wealth in the world. He thought about his little cousins back home, about the times they cried when they were scared. He remembered how he used to sit beside them, making silly faces, humming soft tunes, or distracting them with small games until they calmed down. Maybe, just maybe, he could do the same here. The idea scared him. He was just a kid in economy, after all. What would people think if he stood up and walked toward first class? Would the flight attendants stop him? Would the passengers sneer at him for daring to cross into the rich section? But then he thought about the mother's tear-streaked face, about the father's helpless eyes, about the boy's cries that sounded like his entire world was collapsing. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He sat up straighter, his heart pounding as he made up his mind. He would try. Not for attention, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. While others buried their faces in pillows, cursed under their breath, or drowned the noise with music, the poor black boy leaned forward, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. His knees wobbled slightly, but his resolve was firm. He began walking slowly up the narrow aisle, the stares of curious passengers following him. Some whispered, "Where's he going?" Others frowned, annoyed at the idea of a kid wandering during a meltdown. But he didn't stop. His eyes were fixed on the front of the plane, where the cries of the autistic boy grew louder with each step. The poor boy didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He didn't have a plan, only a heart filled with compassion. But he believed in something few on that plane seemed to remember, that kindness could calm storms when nothing else could. And as he reached the curtain dividing economy from first class, his life and the lives of everyone on that flight were about to change forever. The aisle felt longer than ever as the poor boy walked forward. Every step echoed with the hum of the engines and the constant screams from first class. Heads turned, eyes followed him. Some passengers frowned, some whispered, others simply stared in confusion. He was out of place, a boy in simple clothes crossing the invisible line between economy and wealth. But he didn't stop. He moved past the curtain that separated the two cabins and stepped into the quiet luxury of first class, though at that moment it was far from quiet. The cries of the autistic child pierced the air, bouncing off the polished walls and leather seats. The mother sat rocking her son, her face red and wet with tears. The father sat stiff, gripping his head in his hands, looking like a man defeated. Around them, wealthy passengers sighed loudly, rolled their eyes, and whispered sharp words about ruined flights and poor parenting. The poor boy hesitated for only a second. His heart raced, but his compassion was stronger than his fear. He stepped forward, his voice soft but steady. "Excuse me," he said gently. The mother looked up, startled, her eyes puffy from crying. For a moment, she thought he was just another passenger coming to complain. But then she saw his expression. Not angry, not annoyed, but warm, calm, and full of understanding. "I think, maybe I can help," the boy said quietly. The father blinked, confused. "Help? Son, thank you." But his voice trailed off. He didn't want to be rude, but what could this poor boy possibly do that they hadn't already tried? The poor boy moved closer, slowly, careful not to overwhelm the child. He crouched down so he wasn't towering above him, his eyes level with the boy's tear-streaked face. He didn't touch him. He didn't speak loudly. Instead, he smiled gently and began to hum. It was a simple tune, soft and steady, almost like a lullaby. At first, the autistic child kept screaming, thrashing against his mother's arms. But then his cries faltered for just a second, his ears catching the sound. His head turned slightly, his sobs hiccuping in between. The boy hummed again, louder this time, his rhythm soothing, his tone patient. The child blinked through his tears, his breathing uneven, but his screams began to soften. The poor boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a folded piece of paper he had been doodling on during the flight. With quick hands, he began folding it into something new. The sound of the paper crinkling caught the child's attention. In moments, the poor boy had shaped it into a little paper bird. He held it out slowly, carefully, not forcing it into the child's hands but letting him decide. The child stared, his tears slowing, his screams replaced by short, sharp breaths. His small hand reached out, trembling, and took the bird. The cabin fell silent. The passengers who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. The woman who had covered her ears lowered her hands. The businessman who had been glaring leaned forward, stunned. Every eye was fixed on the scene in front of them. The autistic child held the paper bird carefully, his cries reduced to soft whimpers. The poor boy smiled again and began humming once more, the same soft tune. Slowly, gently, the child leaned against his mother's chest, his body relaxing for the first time since takeoff. Tears streamed down the mother's face as she looked at the poor boy in disbelief. How did you do that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The boy shrugged lightly. "My little cousins get upset sometimes. I sing to them. It helps." His tone was humble, almost shy. The father's eyes filled with tears. He looked at the boy as though seeing an angel in human form. "We tried everything. We couldn't calm him, and you just did. Thank you. Thank you so much." The passengers, who moments ago had judged, sighed, and complained, now sat in stunned silence. A few clapped softly, unable to contain their amazement. Others lowered their heads, ashamed of the harsh things they had whispered earlier. The poor boy didn't care about applause. He stayed crouched beside the child, continuing to hum until the boy's eyes began to close, his tiny hand clutching the paper bird tightly. The cabin was peaceful now, the storm finally quiet. The flight attendants exchanged astonished glances. One whispered to another, "He just did what none of us could." For the mother and father, it was more than just relief. It was a lesson they would never forget. Their wealth, their status, their resources, they hadn't helped in that moment. But kindness, empathy, and a simple paper bird from a poor boy had changed everything. The millionaire reached into his pocket, instinctively wanting to offer money as thanks. But as he looked at the boy's calm face, he stopped. He realized this wasn't something money could buy. This was humanity at its purest. The poor boy stood slowly, giving the parents a small nod before stepping back toward the aisle. He didn't want attention, didn't want reward. He just wanted the child to be okay. But as he walked back to economy, every passenger's eyes followed him. Not with disdain this time, but with respect, admiration, and even shame. The poor boy had done what no one else could. He had reminded them all that compassion matters more than comfort, that kindness is greater than wealth, and that sometimes the smallest act of love can silence the loudest storm. And the plane, once filled with tension and judgment, now carried something else in the air: awe. The silence that filled the cabin was unlike anything the plane had carried before. Only minutes ago, the air had been heavy with tension, the child's screams piercing every corner. Passengers had shifted angrily in their seats, rolled their eyes, and whispered complaints. But now, after the poor boy's gentle humming and the soft rustle of a folded paper bird, the cabin was transformed. The autistic child rested quietly against his mother's shoulder, his tiny fingers gripping the paper bird as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. His chest rose and fell with calmer breaths, his eyes still damp but no longer wild with panic. The storm that had shaken him and everyone else had finally eased, and the passengers were stunned. In first class, the woman in pearls who had been the loudest complainer sat frozen, her hands no longer covering her ears. She stared at the child, then at the poor boy returning to economy, her face flushed with guilt. Only moments earlier she had muttered, "This is unacceptable." Now she whispered, barely audible, "How did he do that?" The businessman who had slammed his laptop shut shook his head slowly, exhaling heavily. He had judged the family, thought their parenting was weak. But now he couldn't deny what he had seen. This wasn't about discipline or control. It was about understanding, and somehow the poor boy had understood when no one else had. In economy, the teenage girl who had been ready to film and mock the situation lowered her phone, embarrassed. She exchanged a glance with her friend, both wide-eyed. "We were so wrong," she admitted softly. Her friend nodded, staring at the boy in awe. The older woman who had whispered, "Poor child," earlier wiped tears from her eyes. She had felt sympathy, yes, but what the poor boy had shown went beyond sympathy. It was compassion in action, gentle, fearless, selfless. She folded her hands together and whispered a prayer of thanks for him. Everywhere in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Passengers who had been irritated were now quiet, reflecting. Some were ashamed of the things they had muttered, the looks they had given the family. Others felt admiration for the poor boy, who had stepped forward when no one else dared. The millionaire father, still shaken, looked around at the passengers. For years, he had been used to commanding respect through wealth and power. But he could see it clearly now. Their respect wasn't on him anymore. It was on the poor boy. He was the one who had captured the hearts of everyone on that plane. The mother clutched her son tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. But for the first time they were tears of relief. She looked at the passengers, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she whispered to no one in particular, though her eyes followed the poor boy's retreating figure. She wanted everyone to know that her son wasn't broken, that he wasn't a problem, that he was a child with struggles that money couldn't fix, but love could ease. The passengers were quiet now, their stares softer, their expressions humbled. Some nodded back at her, silently acknowledging the lesson they had all been given. The poor boy returned to his seat in economy, slipping back into the background as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He didn't expect applause, and he didn't crave attention. To him, what he had done was simple. He had seen someone in pain and tried to help. But to everyone else, it was extraordinary. Even the flight attendants were moved. They whispered among themselves in the galley, shaking their heads in amazement. "That boy just did what no amount of training ever taught us," one said. Another nodded, her voice hushed. "He reminded us what this job is really about, caring for people." The atmosphere on the plane remained hushed for a long while. Passengers leaned back in their seats, but their thoughts were elsewhere. The tension, the frustration, the judgment. It had all dissolved into reflection. They had been shocked, not just by the boy's actions, but by the truth it revealed. Kindness could come from anywhere, even from the seat they hadn't noticed before, even from someone the world often overlooked. The millionaire father looked down at his son, sleeping now with the paper bird still clutched in his hand. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized, painfully and beautifully, that his wealth had not been the answer in that moment. The answer had come from the boy in economy, poor in money, but rich in heart. He leaned back in his seat, whispering softly to his wife, "We'll never forget this." Around them, passengers nodded quietly, as though the whole cabin had silently agreed. What had started as a frustrating, unbearable flight had become something unforgettable. Not because of luxury or comfort, but because of a single act of kindness that shocked everyone into remembering their humanity. And as the plane cut through the sky, thousands of feet above the earth, the passengers carried with them a lesson far heavier than their luggage. True wealth is measured not in money, but in compassion. The flight carried on, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was transformed. The cries that had once filled the air like thunder were gone, replaced by a calm so deep it felt almost sacred. Passengers sat quietly in their seats, their thoughts heavy, their hearts humbled. They knew they had just witnessed something rare, something they would carry long after the plane touched down. The millionaire leaned back in his wide leather seat, staring at his son who now slept peacefully, his small hand still clutching the paper bird. It amazed him, no, it humbled him, that something so simple could do what all his resources could not. He had built a life of luxury, where problems were solved with money, where help could always be bought. Yet in this moment his wealth had meant nothing. His child had found comfort not in the polished walls of first class, not in expensive toys or soothing words from parents drowning in shame, but in the gentle humming of a boy who had nothing. The mother brushed strands of hair from her son's forehead, her own tears finally dry. She kept glancing back toward economy, where the poor boy now sat quietly, gazing out the window as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But to her, he was extraordinary. He was the reason she could breathe again. Around them, passengers remained unusually subdued. Some avoided meeting each other's eyes, ashamed of the complaints they had whispered only minutes earlier. Others stole glances at the poor boy, marveling at his courage. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to blame, but the boy had taught them what they had forgotten. That kindness does not ask about wealth or class or status. Kindness simply acts. One man, the same businessman who had demanded to be moved, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at his folded arms, ashamed of the anger he had carried. He had seen the boy step forward while he had sat still, too proud to help. The thought lingered painfully. Why didn't I do anything? The woman in pearls dabbed her eyes with a napkin. She remembered the way she had glared at the family, how she had muttered that this was unacceptable. Now she felt small, realizing how cruel her impatience had been. The lesson stung, but it was one she knew she needed. Even the flight attendants walked differently now, their steps lighter, their faces softer. They whispered among themselves in awe, one of them saying quietly, "That boy reminded us what this job is really about. Not service. Humanity." The millionaire sat silently for a long time. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The other passengers watched curiously as he walked down the aisle. Not toward the bathroom, not to speak with the attendants, but straight toward economy. There he stopped by the poor boy's seat. The boy looked up, surprised, his eyes cautious. The millionaire crouched so he was at eye level, just as the boy had done with his son. His voice was low, steady, but filled with emotion. "You have done something I will never forget," he said softly. "You gave my son peace when no one else could. You gave us peace. I've spent my life building wealth, but today, you showed me something money can't buy." The boy shifted, uncomfortable with so many eyes on him. He shrugged lightly, his voice almost shy. I just wanted to help. That's all. The millionaire's throat tightened. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. You didn't just help. You changed everything. Some passengers nearby clapped softly. Others nodded, their eyes misty. The respect in the cabin was no longer for the man of wealth, but for the boy who had acted when everyone else sat frozen. The millionaire returned to his seat, his heart heavier but clearer. He realized then that wealth meant nothing without humanity. He promised himself that when this plane landed, his life would change. Not in his business, not in his money, but in the way he carried compassion forward. As the hours passed, the plane hummed steadily through the sky. The autistic child slept peacefully the rest of the journey, the paper bird safe in his hand. His mother never stopped glancing at him, her chest rising and falling with relief. His father held her hand firmly, their silent bond stronger now than ever. And all the passengers, from first class to economy, carried the memory of what they had seen. Some felt ashamed, some inspired, but none would forget. When the plane finally touched down and passengers gathered their belongings, the mood was different. No one rushed, no one pushed. There was a strange sense of unity, as though everyone knew they had shared something that had changed them. The poor boy slipped quietly into the line, ready to walk off the plane and back into the world where his life would remain humble, unnoticed by most. But to those passengers he was unforgettable. They would remember the boy who silenced judgment with kindness, who taught them all that true wealth comes from the heart. The millionaire watched him leave, a quiet smile on his face. He didn't stop him, didn't try to shower him with money or gifts. Instead, he let the boy go, knowing some gifts are too pure to ever repay. And as the passengers stepped back onto the ground, every single one carried a lasting lesson from that flight. That compassion is stronger than judgment. That kindness is greater than wealth. And that sometimes, the most unexpected people carry the power to change us all.